In this lesson, we will learn the main lines, the ideas and plans of the enigmatic openings. There are 3 of them, and let's start with the enigmatic Colle system. So this is going to be your typical setup from the white's perspective. So of course you're going to start with d4 and knight f3 and e3 and put the bishop on d3, secure the center with c3. So you see it feels like some sort of a Christmas tree. The center is incredibly solid. Put the queen on e2, and here you are aiming for the e4 push. As you're going to see in the course, the c4 push for black is very difficult to stop. And even though if the bishop on c1 at the moment feels slightly passive because it has no good squares to go, also the knight blocks it, after the e4 push and maybe even sometimes e5, this bishop has very good chances to become a strong piece. Okay, now let's have a look at some of the common maneuvers in the system. So we start with d4, d5, we play knight f3, we fight for the center, develop the pieces, black plays knight f6. And now there's no need to play the queen's gambit with c4, because what if your opponent just takes it? No, just simply play e3. After e3, black typically responds with something like e6, we put the bishop on d3, black plays c5, and since black wants to play c4, push away our bishop, we play c3. So if black plays c4, we just put the bishop here on c2. So knight c6, castles, castles, knight b to d2. Again, now you see our position kind of resembles the Christmas tree. And after castles, we play queen e2. And here we are about to have a look at 2 key ideas that black can do. So black can typically either play c4, c takes on d4, or the third idea, b6. So let's have a look at the move c4. Now, this move feels pretty logical because black is forcing your bishop to move for a second time, and then black is planning to advance at the queen side, so it pretty makes sense. But the thing is, it also reduces any tension in the center that black had, right? So after c4, we play bishop c2. I think it's very important to keep the bishop here on this diagonal, because we are thinking about some future idea to start a kingside attack. And now, if black plays b5, we play e4. So our idea is to get a considerable space advantage at the king side. If nothing happens in the center, you're considering moves like e5, push away the knight, maybe rook e1, knight f1, knight g3, and literally every single piece that you have is looking at the king's attack. Also, you see the pawn formation forms as an arrow, and it basically points you in direction of the king's side. Another idea here is black could, decide not to keep the tension and play c takes on d4, which is a mistake. But I think that he's hoping that you're going to take with his c pawn. For example, this would be not a great move, because black plays knight b4. You don't want to give up your bishop here on d3. And now you need to watch out for moves like b6 and bishop a6, hitting the queen on e2 and rook on f1. That's why here after c takes on d4, you play e takes on d4. You're stopping knight b4. Again, the pawn arrow, the pawn structure arrow shows you direction that you should be playing towards the king side. Knight e5 is the move. Release the f3 square for the other knight. Bring the bishop in the game. Now you see suddenly this bishop is going to be again a pretty strong piece, and you're just looking for ways to go for a king side attack. Finally, there's a move b6. So here with b6, black wants to play bishop b7. He also builds a pretty comfortable pawn structure. And here it's important for us to react immediately. So we play e4. We use the fact that black is not fully developed, and black could easily fall for some tricks. For example, he decides to play d takes on e4. We take with the knight, and now it feels very tempting to take the pawn on d4 because it's attacked by the knight, by the queen, and it seems like it's a blunder, but actually if somebody blundered, it's black. So we play knight f6, and we play queen e4. So that's the trick. So you see we are threatening with checkmate on h7, and because of the unprotected knight on c6, black is losing material. So those are the core ideas, and of course check out the full course. Now let's move on to the second one, which is the enigmatic Dutch defense, the d4 f5. So basically this is what you can do against anything that white does except of e4, because after e4 move immediately the first move of f5 would be just terrible. I mean, don't try this. And against everything else like d4, like c4, knight f3, g3, b3, the Dutch defense works just fine. So let's have a look at the main line that probably will happen in your games. So we are going to start with d4, f5. Maybe actually the question, why? Why f5? Why not something else? Because the Dutch defense has a reputation of being a sharp, uncompromising continuation, and it kind of mirrors the Sicilian defense. So Sicilian defense would be e4, c5, right? And we are not immediately setting up a symmetrical position, but we are influencing things in the center. So here it's quite similar. We do it exactly the same. We want to play knight f6, put the pawn in front, and then think about ways like e6, b6, bishop b7, bring out the bishop, actually fight for the center. So the main line could be something like c4, e6, knight c3. So white typically plays any opening like this, especially at the club level. Now we play bishop b4, pin the knight, and if white plays knight f3, we take on c3 here and play knight f6. So white has doubled the pawns here, and by the way, this pawn on c4 will be one of the key problems that white will have to tackle with in the near future. So for example, white plays e3, the typical move here is b6. We give our light square bishop a long diagonal. So bishop d3, bishop b7, castles, castles. And if at some point white plays a4, white wants to get rid of this weakness by playing a5. Responding with a5 is actually not the best move, but here we can play knight e4. We centralize the knight, and typically this signals a potential kingside attack. Now let's have a look at some of the continuations after knight e4. For example, here white decides to take with the bishop. After bishop takes on e4, we can actually capture the pawn. And after knight e2, we're thinking about starting a kingside attack with moves like queen h4, rook f6, rook h6, or even rook g6 in some lines, and these pawns are quite difficult to defend. So if white's going to play something like f4, try to protect the king side, we always take on f3, expose the king, and this bishop is essentially an extra piece in a direct attack, because if you did the lesson about opposite-colored bishops, in a direct attack, the opposite-colored bishops are feeling like an extra piece. Another continuation after knight e4 might be the move queen c2 here, so white is protecting the pawn on c3. And now the key move, the key idea to know is knight c6. So we're kind of blocking the knight on e4, but we are thinking about moves like knight a5 to attack the pawn on c4. And by the way, we're also blocking white's intentions to push a5. So the big question is, what happens if white takes the pawn? Takes, and queen e4. Now here's the key idea. We play knight a5, we hit the queen and the knight. So if white plays queen d3, we do not take on f3 with the bishop, we take with the rook. Why? Because g takes on f3 runs in a very swift mate. Check here, bishop f3, and mate on the board. So we immediately manage to checkmate our opponent's king in just 15 moves. So you see, the Dutch defense has many fast attacking ideas, and you are gonna, I'm sure, win a lot of memorable games. Finally, there's the third enigmatic course, the Sicilian defense. This is the so-called Kalashnikov setup with e5. And we are weakening some squares in the center, but we are about to compensate them with a very dynamic game. Now, let's have a look at some lines. For example, here. So we are starting out with d4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, very popular continuation nowadays. So white plays the principal continuation, d4, c takes, knight e4, and e5. So with e5, we are pushing away the knight from the center, and it seems that white has to play knight e5. White wants to play knight e6 check, or maybe white is actually dreaming about knight c3, knight e5, and try to give you a fork on c7. So we play here d6 would stop this possibility. We are going to push the knight from b5 with a6, and then focus on something at the king side. Let's have a look at some of the lines. For example, here in this position, white plays c4. It makes perfect sense, because the Marazzi bind setup, pawns on e4 and c4 against the pawn on d6, is one of the most famous and well-known pawn setups in chess. So white wants to play knight c3, put the knight on d5, and say that your pawn on d6 is so weak, I'm doing great. In theory, it probably is like that, but you see, also by playing c4, white weakens the d4 square. So as soon as black is going to play a6, draw away this knight, black will have a very nice control of the d4 square. So the main line here goes with g6, because the bishop here is pretty passive, we want to give it a new role. Knight c3, now we have to play a6 so that we can bring out the bishop in the game. Knight goes here, bishop e6, bishop g7, and knight f6. You see all of these moves are perfectly normal. Short castle, we want to control the d4 square, we are pressing the pawn on c4, and we're thinking about some very interesting dynamic ideas. Maybe in some lines you even play knight e4, sack the pawn, open the docks with bishop, rook typically goes to c8, and white can quite easily lose the game threat here. Another idea here, instead of c4, white could try to play knight c3, which makes perfect sense because white wants to play knight e5, occupy the d5 square, threaten with a fork on c7, at the same time keep a better control of the d4 square. We still play a6 because one of the key ideas, I think is pretty easy to remember, you play a6 when the knight cannot retreat to c3. So now it has to go to this awkward a3 square. Now we play bishop e7. So we complete our development. We, by the way, stop the bishop g5 idea, which is one of the key ideas in the Sicilian Sveshnikov. Knight f6 allows bishop g5 idea, but with this move order is simply impossible. Now white plays knight e5, trying to play some ideas like bishop e3, bishop b6 against some fork ideas on c7, and that's why we play knight f6, apply pressure, make sure this never happened. And here after knight e7, I think that black is just perfectly fine, an equal position, active pieces, and white has a weird knight on a3 and potential problems to solve. That's it. So that was the introduction to the 3 enigmatic courses. Hope you like them, get the full course, and have fun.